Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Therese Corey, and I'm the director of the History of Philosophy Forum. We're very excited to have you all here at Notre Dame joining us today for the Minds in Dialogue conference today and tomorrow. I know we also have people joining us on Zoom, so thank you for being here. And this is the third and final conference in our 3-year cycle of the project Modeling the Mind in the History of Philosophy. So it's particularly excited to see how this project has developed over the last few years and be here for the culminating activity of this project. I'm particularly grateful to our speakers for being here despite all of the travel disruptions yesterday. Paulina and I were sheltering in the basement of the Morris Inn last night, and I know several people were delayed and took an Uber, and I was worried that they had possibly ended up driving into the path of a tornado at one point, but everybody made it, so it's great to have you all here at Notre Dame for some beautiful post-tornado weather. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, my co-organizer, Denis Robichaud, who is going to talk a little bit about the conference theme, just to get our thoughts in order, and then we will begin with our first paper.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning online and everyone in the room. I want to share Therese, her thanks and her acknowledgement to all of you for coming and traveling to South Bend to participate in this conference. And I'm honored that Therese asked me to prepare some opening remarks about the theme of the conference. As she just mentioned, the 2 previous years we spoke on the first 2 facets of the theme of modeling the mind in the history of philosophy. The first, cognizing being, looking at metaphysical models of the mind, and the second, the life of the mind, that was governed by the overarching concept of life. And our present colloquium, as we outlined years ago, the theme was to investigate models of the mind as private or inner selves on the one hand, as well as dialogical, linguistic, social, and intersubjective understandings of mental activity on the other hand. So, a couple of words on this. So given the preponderance of attention directed today towards artificial intelligence, one might dare to say that a certain dialogic model of mind is on the ascendance. But I need to be careful with my wording. I'm not at present making a claim that AI is or is not a mind, nor that our interactions with it are even dialogical, but simply that the way in which the input of data into a neural network serves as a prompt to trigger a corresponding output of data has been packaged in various interfaces as a semblance of face-to-face dialogue with chatbots, as the etymology also suggests. This is not to say that we should be confirming or validating any kind of notion of mind from Silicon Valley in today's colloquium. And in fact, I hope that our colloquium might help us recover lost accounts of mind. And this all to say that there might be even more reason for us to meet today to look at the long history of dialogic models of mind in philosophy. And I don't make these observations as a prompt to any of you that we as historians of philosophy should constantly direct our attention to questions of AI when we study past models of mind, nor that we should even do so today. Nothing has become a stale platitude faster in academia than the belief that every subject should be responding to AI. Still, responses are needed, and understanding how philosophies of mind deployed by specialists and by popular imagination to understand AI relate to the long history of philosophy of mind might lead to new insights. And I'd say even despite the relevance of AI, the fact that philosophers working on the history of philosophy before the 20th century have largely ignored AI compared to other fields might mean that their thinking on the matter could have the salutary effect of distancing and destabilizing present models of mind to explain AI, forcing us to think about alternative accounts of dialogical mental activity and possible alternatives to present and future understandings. So, if the 2 previous installments of our series, Modeling the Mind in the History of Philosophy, investigated models of mind dominated by the terms being and life, we should not be surprised if these terms still make an appearance in our colloquium today and tomorrow. In fact, scholars of ancient and medieval philosophy know that for many pre-modern philosophers, it was impossible to disassociate mind from being and life, insofar as mind was often understood as interlocked or interconnected with being, life as well. So since we're going to begin our discussion of the topic today with Plato, Platonism, along with Buddhism, I thought that I might permit myself to say something about Plato as a brief word of introduction on the topic. In his dialogue, The Sophist, Plato begins to interweave these three terms that I've introduced here, being, life, and intellect, when he makes his character, the Eleatic stranger, explain that the absolute or complete being is something that also lives and thinks, words that I believe influenced Aristotle's book Lambda of the Metaphysics, but that might be controversial. The stranger further explains that it is impossible to understand anything in isolation without understanding how it relates to other things. In explaining that not being should not be understood as a contrary to being, but as otherness, the Eleatic stranger holds that being and not being, or non-being, express the fundamental conditions of relations in reality, and as we conceive of these relations in our soul. It's impossible to conceive of something in isolation from how it relates to other things, since any understanding leads to intermixed relations, the stranger articulates. Discourse, like all things that exist, he contends, is fundamentally an interweaving of relations. I quote, "Our object was to establish discourse as one of our classes of being, for if we were deprived of this, we should be deprived of philosophy, which would be the greatest calamity. Moreover, we must at the present moment come to an agreement about the nature of discourse, and if we were robbed of it by its absolute non-existence, we could no longer discourse, and we should be robbed of it if we agreed that there is no mixture of anything with anything else. Reality and discourse, the Eleatic stranger contends, are interwoven relations. It is dialogic. But what about the activities of mind?" The stranger continues, "Well, thinking, dianoia, discursive thinking, and discourse, logos, are the same thing, except that what we call thinking is precisely the inward dialogue carried on by the mind with itself, without spoken sound." He continues, "Well then, since we've seen that there is true and false statement, and of these mental processes we found thinking to be a dialogue of the mind with itself, and judgment to be the conclusion of thinking, what we mean by it appears, phanatai, as a blend of perception and judgment. It follows that these also, being of the same nature as statements, or perhaps of the same family or family relations, must be some of them, and on some occasions false. So the stranger claims not just that mind and discourse are dialogic, but also that they share a phenomenology, if I can use that term, of making beings present to us, the phanatai, he says, either through language in dialogue or with others, either dialogue with others or with thought thinking with itself. These two conversations aren't completely incommensurable, the Eleatic stranger contends, since they're part of the same family of being, he says. For what comes to light in conversations with others and in interior conversations are part of the same process of self-knowledge. This common relationship of dialogue and thought means that contradictions that emerge in conversations with another person also hold when thinking one's own thoughts. That is, the principle of non-contradiction seems to hold for both philosophical conversations and self-examination. The notion that something is in common in language and in thought or concepts seems to be at work in the Platonic dialogues themselves, insofar as they serve as examples of Socratic, or in this case, Eleatic elenchus. It's in dialogue that we see concepts form, that we see them being tested or corrected based off a shared examination of common notions or common language, as well as an appeal to common principles, for instance, non-contradiction, or in the case of the sophist, not just being, life, and intellect, but also the 5 great kinds that are introduced here, that those two being interlocked or interrelated. Be that as it may, in the sophist, Plato seems to leave the question open whether the relation of speech and mind, or rather of the two dialogues, the dialogue of speech with other persons and the dialogue of mind with ourselves, whether this relationship is a relation of identicality or a relation of homonymy. For the argument that thought takes the form of discursive internal dialogue raises the question, without immediately answering, although I think Plato does actually put forward an answer to this in the dialogue, but it raises the question whether self-knowledge consists simply of a series of successive internal self-presentations as dialogues with another, just as you would encounter endless potential interlocutors. And in this dialogic model of mind, mental activity and discourse might have a relation of identicality. Or whether dialogic self-knowledge leads to something prior to these successive internal self-presentations or states, which would be something like a pre-discursive core of one's identity. In this dialogical model of mind, mental activity and dialogue would have something like a homonymous relationship to each other. So I intend these brief opening remarks to be nothing more than a simple warm-up exercise, or if you prefer, something like an opening act for the headlining acts of today's colloquium. If the titles of the speakers' papers today are signs of things to come, I foresee and welcome discussions about self-knowledge, identity, personhood, thinking with others, metaphysics of language and thought, the problems of intentionality in speech and thought, subjectivity, the possibility of translating subjects. I also foresee us asking whether concepts or thoughts mediate the relationship between words and things, or, as Aristotle might seem to suggest, that words are mere symbols or of affects of soul, or whether concepts and thoughts are instead received or formed linguistically or dialogically, or again, whether concepts, or at least their contents, are reducible to propositions, as Aristophanes might envision, so that all thought is ultimately reducible to thought of P1, P2, etc., in which case one might wonder whether propositional mind is identical to dialogic mind. I also foresee us asking whether concepts are shareable between minds because they're in common, as Plato, to stick with my first example, might express in the Theaetetus, like a common tongue, or whether they're shareable and translatable by minds in dialogue, as their colloquium's title suggests. And it's too early to know whether I anticipated some of our topics correctly, since in introducing our colloquium today, I'm cast in the role of something like a fortune teller, predicting what our speakers will argue today and tomorrow. That is, I'm reading the titles of their papers as though they're the birds in the sky, like a Roman augur, to determine what lies ahead. But in appealing to the translation of a common language of birds, as well as to human language, I fear that I'm becoming a little too bird-brained. So I'll stop with this nonsense and just say that I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank our sponsors, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, the History Philosophy Forum, the University of Notre Dame, my co-organizers, Stephen Ogden, Katharina Kraus, who isn't here right now, and Therese Corey, of course, as well as Chris, who I believe is here somewhere, for all of the tireless work organizing for the History of Philosophy Forum. Thank you.
I'd like to echo the welcome of my colleagues, Therese and Denis. And without further ado, to introduce our first speaker, Christian Coseru from the College of Charleston and University of California at Berkeley. And his paper today is Self-Knowledge for Selfless Persons, a Platonist Critique of Buddhist Reductionism. Christian.
Thank you. So I'm just going to do the old-fashioned, paper reading, except that it's a digital. So thank you to the organizers. It's a pleasure to speak here to the History of Philosophy Forum. This is a wonderful intellectual exercise in dialogue within traditions, and in this case across philosophical traditions. So let me preface what I'm going to be talking about today by saying that That's what I'm going to be doing here today grows out of a research project that's been going on for several years now, starting just on the eaves of the pandemic, where a group of philosophers who have expertise in both the Platonic and the Buddhist traditions got together and engaged in sort of interesting intellectual exchanges. The results of those exchanges came out as a book just last year with Oxford, Crossing the Stream Out of the Cave. And I have a paper there on which the talk today builds. Let's see, can we go back? Can we go back to this? Yeah, thank you. All right. So, in keeping with the theme of this year's colloquium, Minds in Dialogue, my focus today will be on two seemingly irreconcilable models of mind, those inherited from the Platonic and the Indian Buddhist philosophical tradition, respectively. The question I wish to pursue is, what do metaphysical commitments to a particular conception of personal identity mean for debates about the nature and scope of self-knowledge? Now, owing to their, owing to their distinct metaphysical commitments, it should come as no surprise that Platonism and Buddhism offer significantly different answers to this question. Indeed, a view of reality as reducible to a domain of immutable principles, including individuating principles such as the psyche, paints a rather different picture of self-knowledge and a commitment to an ontology of dependently arisen concrete property particulars, the dharmas that Buddhist philosophers talk about. Now, two caveats before I proceed any further. First, my concern here is with one of the classical problems of self-knowledge. That is, to what extent does knowing oneself, as urged by the Delphic maxim, makes knowing itself possible or indeed better? Knowledge itself, heautes, is a type of episteme that Plato treats as indeed different than knowledge of oneself. A related question is whether knowing oneself also makes one wiser, so that one becomes more than, let's say, or at least it's not at the mercy of a collection of dispositions, impressions, and reactive attitudes. There is a close analog to this problem in Buddhism, most notably when at the end of his long career, the Buddha urges his followers to be a lamp unto themselves by seeking the guidance of their reasoned deliberations and disciplined practice. In the interest of clarity, I should also note that while the problem of self-knowledge in contemporary epistemology and philosophy of mind is mainly associated with questions of privileged access, phenomenal transparency, and distinctness, specifically whether self-knowledge differs in important ways than knowledge in other domains, the issues that both classical and Buddhist philosophers raise about the character of knowledge and the grounds for certainty are not entirely irrelevant to contemporary debates. Second, the approach I adopt is systematic rather than historical or comparative. It is in keeping with what is sometimes called fusion or confluence philosophy, or even cosmopolitan philosophy. What's unique about this approach that's people like us who work into different philosophical traditions do or pursue is that unlike comparing and contrasting, the approach remains faithful to a conception of philosophy as an intellectual enterprise grounded primarily in dialogue and argumentation. So while this approach recognizes philosophy's complex heritage, it also opens out the possibility that critical engagement with ideas from one tradition in light of another can have both illuminating and unsettling effects, in much the same way that flow dynamics can take on both concordant and discordant forms when two streams join one another. So I'll proceed as follows. First, I will briefly sketch the reductionist account of personal identity that Buddhism is well known for and its implications, specifically considering what factors could motivate, let alone sustain, practices of self-scrutiny and cultivation in the absence of a stable principle of identity. I will then consider whether the Platonic knowledge-belief discontinuity, which limits knowledge to universals only, places the self outside the purview of knowledge, thus raising the question, what would self-knowledge without a self entail? Drawing primarily on Charmides and Alcibiades, the only two dialogues that subject the problem of self-knowledge to a direct dialectical examination, I will briefly reflect on what doubts about the possibility of knowledge mean for the impersonal self-interpretation. Now, of course, the Buddhist self-knowledge project cannot be about figuring out what the self in self-knowledge stands for. Rather, belief in a unitary self as the locus of experience, which is taken to be both plain wrong by Buddhists, as a result of considered to be the defect of speculative reason, and also morally problematic, insofar as it supposedly impedes genuine altruistic behavior, is precisely what the Buddhist knowledge project targets. But I will also consider whether a particular account of epistemic practice in terms of the mind's reflexive dimension acknowledges the need to retain an experiential, or at the very least a minimally subjective principle of identity. Given this doctrinal stance on personal identity, it would seem indeed that Buddhism leaves little room for something analogous to the Socratic self-doubt, specifically as it finds expression in the Apology, where Socrates famously declares, "I am aware of being wise in nothing great or small." I will thus argue that if self-scrutiny makes us present to ourselves by allowing us to inhabit both poles of the dialogical relation, we must concede that self-knowledge is neither given nor guaranteed. The presence of a reflexive form of awareness notwithstanding, self-knowledge, I would claim, is ultimately a human, all too human affair that makes its personal dimension inescapable. So let me say something about the Buddhist Reductionist project, the no-self project. In one of his earlier discourses, the Buddha declares that we ought to regard any form of sensation and consciousness, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, manifest or subtle, as it actually is. This is not mine, this is not myself, this is not what I am. The rejection of a permanent self as the agent of sensory and mental activity, of course, posed a significant challenge for early Buddhists. If there is no agent, and if actions are merely transient events arising within a continuum of causally interconnected states, how is the efficacy of human moral and epistemic practices to be explained? Historically, at least one Buddhist school, that of the so-called Pudgalavadins, or the personalists, did come to endorse the reality of persons, which they conceived as on the basis of the aggregates, although they regarded them as neither identical nor different from those aggregates, as a bundle conception of personal identity, not unlike the Humean picture. But this was a largely heterodox school. Now, disagreement among modern interpreters attests to the difficulty of providing a definitive account of this core aspect of Buddhist metaphysics. Early Pali scholars like Carolyn Davis thought that the way Buddhists understood and used the term consciousness was not indeed very different than the way, say, the Upanishadic philosophers talked about a self. Similarly, Horner suggested that some canonical passages in the Buddhist canonical literature actually provide support for the notion of a supposedly unchanging witness. The Sanskrit is Shakshi, in Pali Saki. A view also defended in the recent philosophical reworking of the notion of witness consciousness by Miri al-Bahari. Largely in response to needing to account for the persistence of a mental something, the later Buddhist philosophical tradition, specifically associated with the Yogacara, introduced the concept of a latent or warehouse or storehouse consciousness. They were concerned primarily with the need to account for, this was reflecting a need to account for the synchronic and diachronic aspects of conscious experience. The idea of a latent consciousness, of course, is also meant to address the problem of self-intimation, of the seeming fact that conscious states exhibit a distinctive subjective aspect that marks them as occurring for this mental stream rather than another. Indeed, the later development of the Buddhist philosophical tradition, that taken by this Yogacara school, captures efforts to account for both psychological continuity and individuation, and suggests the conception of latent consciousness as a persisting basis or ground for phenomenal unity, which is what the Buddhists too experienced. And that explains why non-Buddhists and even some Buddhist opponents thought that this particular school, the Yogacara school, reintroduced into Buddhism the old concept of a substantive self. Now, the prevailing view, however, is that such interpretations are tenuous. Indeed, later Buddhist traditions developed specific notions, the alavijnana, or the storehouse consciousness, precisely in order to avoid the metaphysical implications of the traditional notion of a self. There are extensive critiques of the various attempts to find support, indeed, in the canonical literature, for the existence of a higher self, perhaps equated with consciousness itself. And there's a vast body of literature on this. There are also efforts to work out the implications of recent debates in philosophy of mind about things like no ownership and attention-based views of conscious awareness, with the suggestion being that this might serve to foreground various aspects of the Buddhist no-self view. Now, it has also been claimed, in particular by Stephen Collins in his classical work, Selfless Person, that the notion of a self that witnesses most probably refers to deeper aspects of consciousness acting as conscience. Collins himself claims that, for instance, the metaphysical notion of a self as eternal, unchanging is actually just plain erroneous, a defect of speculative opinion. Taking the body as the self is problematic as well. Consciousness itself cannot be the self. It is also impossible to speak of a self apart from experience. And lastly, a false sense of self may be acquired from the habitual use of pronominal forms such as I and mine. Furthermore, in a similarly detailed and thorough analysis of both Buddhist and Brahmanical views of personal identity, Klaus Ottke, also in a classical work, took the non-self view to reflect, took the non-self doctrine as reflective of a revisionary metaphysics which denies not a self as such, but rather the self as something qualified by the property of being the subject of experience or as the referent of such subjective experience. Indeed, the denial of a permanent self, as well as the refusal to treat persons as referring to anything real and permanent, forms an integral part of the Buddhist analysis of consciousness. But if this Buddhist account of personal identity is built, as it is claimed, on phenomenological, thus descriptive, rather than metaphysical grounds, the obvious question arises. Is there an individuating principle of experience that tells the knower that the experience is hers, that it happens in her mental stream? As I will argue, an awareness individuated by its directness towards an object only grounds knowledge of this object. This is what it is to say that consciousness is intentionally constituted. In part, that explains why efforts to address this issue have been central to the problem of self-knowledge, whether with regard to the classical question of what kind of thing the soul or self must be in order to serve as both subject and object of knowledge, or in response to contemporary concerns about first-person access to occurrent mental states. As should be obvious by now, addressing the problem of self-knowledge in ways that consider both its nature and the justification for its possibility has implications for the question of personal identity, the question of what our sense of being the person that we are necessarily consists of. So, what then grounds this reasoned, if aporetic, deliberations in the service of the examined life? Is it a self or a soul, a particular function or faculty of the mind, or is it something altogether different? So now let me turn to the Platonic tradition. So is self-knowledge the same as knowledge of a self? Or is it a distinctive feature or faculty of the mind or the soul? Answering this question, of course, requires that we first consider what the self of self-knowledge to whom the maxim is addressed entails. More to the point, if it is addressed to someone or something, does that someone or something precede efforts to know it? Or rather, is the self, or at the very least, the sense of self itself, a product of this knowledge? There are several options here. But one thing is clear. How we answer these questions depends in large measure on whether what is being sought in some sense already exists or is yet to come into being. If it already exists, then self-knowledge is merely an attribute or aspect of the self. It is that in virtue of which the self is made known or manifest. If it does not, then the challenge is no longer about finding out what it means for the self to know itself, but about the very possibility of self-knowledge. Can knowing itself revert upon itself without any sense of whom or what this reverting is for? More to the point, what does an awareness of knowing oneself as a knower contribute over and above what is available by acquiring various kinds of skill or expertise, whether in music, medicine, shipbuilding, or indeed philosophy? So let me just say something about, let me take a closer look at these two Platonic dialogues that I mentioned as being sort of, in some sense, the locus classicus for some of this debate. So the locus classicus for the Platonic inquiry into the nature of self-knowledge and its limitation is Charmides. As Critias points out at 166, see in response to Socrates' objection that all types of knowledge must either produce something definitive or at least be about something definitive, self-knowledge has itself as an object. This conception of knowing itself, which this dialogue associates with temperance or self-control, sophrosune, cannot be a mere imaginary construct. Rather, by virtue of the intrinsically reflexive properties of knowing, the Socratic/Platonic knower as a sophron can temper, moderate, and even unify her divergent dispositions and beliefs. For now, let us just briefly consider Socrates' contention that if self-control is, and I quote, knowing something, it obviously must be a kind of knowledge, and it must be knowledge of something. At the very least, of a disposition towards moderation or self-control. Now, what follows if this disposition grants a basic sense of oneself as a knower? First, we learn that self-control is the only kind of knowledge which knows itself and all other cases of knowledge, as well as Socrates gets Critias to admit in the end, quote, knowledge of the lack of knowledge. In short, as Socrates concludes, it all comes down to the idea that, and I quote, there is one special kind of knowledge which is knowledge of nothing but itself and all other cases of knowledge, and that this same knowledge is also knowledge of the absence of knowledge. This is a rather extraordinary assertion. It essentially amounts to saying that this capacity of reverting onto itself is ultimately what grounds awareness of the reach and limits of knowledge. We also get an early account of course, the intentionality of cognition in that, quote, knowledge in itself is taken to be knowledge of something, or to have the property of being of something, since anything whose property is relative to itself will also have the attribute to which the property is relative. So, is self-knowledge such as to possess its property, the property of knowing, intrinsically, rather than relative to any specific object or content? Consider that close, practical analog to self-knowledge, namely the virtue of temperance or self-control. It is part of the very notion of self-control that there can be certain things that only relate to themselves or to aspects of themselves. Self-control, after all, is only conceivable relative to a regulatory capacity. But this is precisely the claim Socrates thinks must warrant scrutiny, since it is not established that the existence of knowledge, of the knowledge of knowledge, is indeed possible. The position is further complicated by the fact that such knowledge functions as an attribute of the individual, of a mind or soul, such that possessing self-knowledge would amount to being knowledgeable about oneself, specifically about one's character, dispositions, and skills. It is at this point in the dialogue that we get that all-important distinction between knowledge that and knowledge what. If self-control is not a matter of knowing what one does and does not know, then its possession amounts only to knowing that one knows and not what one knows or what one's knowledge is about. a problematic position that calls into question the means by which we ascertain expertise. Is self-control worth striving for if all that it can deliver is the certainty that another person has knowledge of some kind, but not what this knowledge is of? Claims of medical knowledge or of any other kind of expertise would have to be taken at their face value without any way of assessing the veracity of the claim. At the very least, one would have to be a medical expert oneself in order to ascertain whether claims of medical knowledge are true. In short, it would seem that self-control alone does not confer any advantage in assessing whether the claims of expertise are accurate. And there's a wonderful passage that it clearly follows then that if self-control is nothing but knowledge or lack of knowledge, a self-controlled person would be incapable of distinguishing between a healer who knows his art and a quack who is pretending or who thinks that he knows the art. So, if a self-controlled or wise man, a sophon, cannot distinguish good from bad medicine or a true physician from a quack, what good is self-knowledge for? As an aporetic dialogue, Charmides only presents us, of course, with the idea that in some sense it is possible to know both that one knows and what one does not know, leaving open the question whether the possession of this kind of first-order knowledge confers any benefit. But while the dialogue does not deliver on the promise of clarifying the scope of self-knowledge, or indeed its value, at least it provides some guarantee that self-knowledge facilitates the operations of other kinds of knowledge. Captains, for instance, speaking of captains, since some of us were stranded in Chicago due to the weather yesterday, captains, let's say airline pilots, know themselves to be captains by virtue of knowing how to navigate ships, in this case airplanes, whether any passengers aboard their ships or airplanes should travel along to their destinations. Indeed, we didn't in the end, for good reasons. In much the same way, the art of, say, shoemaking confers upon cobblers the ability to make shoes without the additional knowledge of whether any and all persons should be wearing them. Or, since AI got mentioned in the opening remarks, computer coders know themselves as coders in light of their ability to design and build generative AI systems such as ChatGPT without knowing, as indeed expert programmers, whether any and all users should be allowed on their platforms. They shouldn't. Whether this self-reflexive dimension of knowledge by virtue of which we know ourselves as captains, cobblers, and coders confers some additional benefit remains, however, an open question, though Charmides does hint at the idea that only knowledge of what is good and bad can function as a conduit to moral excellence. So now let me briefly turn to Alcibiades I. It is in this dialogue in Alcibiades that we get both a clearer account, and I'll leave aside for now the controversies about the authenticity of the dialogue, that we get both a clear account of the nature of self-knowledge and an assurance of its importance. Like Charmides, which uses the analogy between vision and knowledge, Alcibiades appeals to the trope of surfaces with reflective properties to explain what it means for a person to know himself. In the previous dialogue, Socrates had wondered whether cognition is solely about the object or it's also about itself. In short, whether its intentionality presupposes its reflexivity. Can, say, color be seen without there being any awareness that it is an experience for someone, what phenomenologists call the dative of manifestation? Or as Socrates puts it, can sight, opsis, see itself? Alcibiades is less concerned with cognition's own self-reflexive properties and more with what it means to be a knower, the kind of person whom the Delphic injunction addresses. Unlike Charmides, which presents us with the conceptual problem of self-knowledge, what we find in Alcibiades is an articulation of the personal dimensions of self-knowledge. Reading Alcibiades as an invitation to explore the ways in which self-knowledge reveals certain aspects of oneself does not, however, mean that we have here the workings of a, say, proto-psychoanalytic method, with Socrates, say, helping Alcibiades work through his, I don't know, childhood experiences and traumas or neuroses as a way of understanding his current condition. Rather, the main concern is human nature itself, what we ourselves are. Of course, as Julianas argued a long time ago, and other interpreters, this mode of inquiry is and I quote, objective rather than a personal subjective matter. As a dialogical rather than introspective type of knowing, it can only be achieved in the presence of others. Indeed, someone like Socrates may be in a position to know me better than I know myself. That certain features of human nature are universally shared can be known by virtue of their universal properties, suggests a different take on the nature of self-knowledge. Rather than targeting individual characteristics, self-knowledge may instead concern something impersonal. And indeed, we find support for this view in Socrates' insistence that dialogue takes place between souls rather than bodies. And I quote, "When you and I talk to each other, one soul addresses the other soul by means of words." Alcibiades. Since on the Socratic Platonic metaphysical picture, we are most essentially our soul rather than our body and soul taken together, or the body alone, it would seem as if the intellective or rational part of our soul is also the least personal, insofar as the capacity to reason draws us closer to the forms which are indeed universal and unities. Now, much of the debate about whether self-knowledge pertains to the self itself hinges on whether what is thus known is yet another form, perhaps the real, form-like, and intellectual self. There's a vast body of scholarship on this, Johnson, Ryder, Scheffler. Champions of the impersonal or universally shared human nature interpretation do indeed advance precisely such a claim. To the extent that self-knowledge pertains to the soul, it does not reveal anything specific or personal. And some have picked up on this theme, particularly some of my Buddhist Platonist colleagues, to say, look, you know, there are some affinities there between the Platonic picture of personal identity and the Buddhist picture of personal identity, insofar as the tendency is to strive for this sort of achieving or attaining this impersonal self, that it's form-like. But as I claim, the impersonal interpretation is problematic in that it does not explain how exactly we are supposed to care for an individuated and numerically distinct yet impersonal soul, let alone what makes it a vehicle for self-cultivation. If the explanation is that knowing such a self is in some sense, and I quote, akin to what is divine and immortal, the question remains, how is such knowledge made manifest in ways that are recognizable to the individual person? Critics of the impersonal self-interpretation, people like Ryder, Reeve, and Moore, among others, and I would include myself in that group, point out that in many other dialogues, in Gorgias, in Phaedo, in the Republic, in Phaedrus, we get a rather different picture of the souls. Although disembodied, they're nonetheless said to manifest many of the personal characteristics they bore in real life. Whether this alternative conception of human nature serves as a better referent for the object of self-knowledge ultimately depends on how we interpret the soul as mirror passage from Alcibiades and Socrates' rather enigmatic suggestion that we only truly know ourselves when we recognize all that is divine. Here, however, I'm less concerned with the physics or indeed metaphysics of souls and more with what a conception of self-knowledge, what conception of self-knowledge can be pieced together from Plato's epistemological commitments. The question concerns how we go about finding out who indeed we truly are. Now, while Alcibiades by no means gives us the definitive account of self-knowledge, it does offer what I would argue is one of the most compelling interpretations of the Delphic injunction. And this is how Socrates puts it at 132 D1. I'll tell you what I suspect this inscription means, and this is a well-known passage, highly debated, of course. There may not be many examples of it except in the case of sight. If the inscription took our eyes to be men and advised them, see thyself, How would we understand such advice? Shouldn't the eye be looking at something in which it could see itself? Then let's think of something that allows us to see both it and ourselves when we look at it. To which, of course, Alcibiades responds, obviously, Socrates, you mean mirrors and that sort of thing. Because when we look others in the eye, our face appears in them like in a mirror, we can rightly say, argues Socrates, that the eye sees itself when it observes another eye directly. So the argument goes, seeing, in this case, is itself seen. Put in the language of phenomenology, seeing is a reflexive act. We can only see if the seeing itself is self-intimating, right? If it makes itself present as occurring for someone or from a particular vantage point. Since the eye cannot see another without seeing itself, the argument goes, self-reflexive perception provides the best analogy for self-knowledge. So let me just turn here briefly to say something about reflexivity itself and the critique of the Buddhist reductionist account of personal identity. One more caveat. Despite the use of these visual tropes, at least in Alcibiades, the Platonic epistemology of self-knowledge is a thoroughly intellectual enterprise. It rests on a conception of personal identity which says that I am essentially what I think. How I feel, what I like, and how I comport myself may make a difference in the formation of character, but they do not determine the intellective structure of this form-like soul or self. A conception of self-knowledge as concerned with the structure of awareness is also at work in Buddhist efforts to understand how, given the causally conditioned nature of phenomena, transient cognitive states come to apprehend themselves as something permanent and a self. In that regard, Buddhism does share with Platonists a common understanding of self-knowledge, that self-knowledge is essentially knowledge about oneself as a knower. In short, it is de se rather than de re knowledge. Now, given the universal scope of the no-self doctrine, specifying what exactly the relation of knowing to knower entails becomes paramount for Buddhists. Of course, Buddhist accounts of substantive self-knowledge cannot rest on egological conceptions of self-consciousness, that is, on conception of consciousness or awareness as the property, function, or dimension of an enduring subject or self. Just what it means then for there to be self-knowledge without enduring subjects as knowers thus remains an open question. Indeed, if experience is taken to lack any self-specifying features and cognitions are regarded as merely transient events arising within a continuum of causally interconnected states, it becomes difficult to explain the distinctly phenomenal character of knowledge episodes. As I said earlier, their occurrence as if for someone. And yet, Buddhist epistemology, or the Buddhist epistemological tradition, reflects a profound concern with the implications of the no-self view for the problem of self-knowledge. This concern finds expression in a rich set of Abhidharma debates about whether it is possible, for instance, for a single mind moment to be epistemically salient, to bring about the kind of knowledge that can result in self-correcting patterns of thought. I'll just briefly mention here a particular group of philosophers known as the Mahasamgikas, who think that the very capacity to become a Buddhist practitioner, to enter in the so-called path, depends on being able to experience momentary flickers or flashes of self-luminosity. They maintain that these instances of self-luminous awareness explain how it is possible for a mental state to become reflexively self-conscious in a single moment. Of course, that is because they have a metaphysical commitment, among other things, to the principle of momentariness. And also, this group of philosophers think that these luminous moments are essential, experiencing them is essential to undoing ingrained habits of thought and action. Buddhist metaphysics indeed claims that nothing, not even these moments of awareness, can stand, of course, outside the causally conditioned web of phenomena, which also includes non-cognitive and subpersonal factors, such as, of course, the body with its various dispositions. Hence, the Buddhist self-knowledge project cannot be about the attainment of awareness simpliciter, for that would deny its discerning capacity. Awareness, after all, illuminates itself as something, nor can it be exclusively about the objects or contents themselves, for that will leave unexplained for whom these contents are known. The causal principle of dependent arising, which is an axiomatic principle of Buddhist metaphysics, demands indeed that phenomena arise interdependently, such that entities and events possess their properties extrinsically rather than intrinsically, indeed by virtue of their placement in the causal web. As the canonical formula goes, visual awareness arises and depends on a visual system and visual objects. Now, this way of framing the causal relation, however, confronts us with an explanatory gap. The causal account cannot explain why, in addition to their extrinsic or relational properties, certain elements in this causal chains come to exhibit intrinsic properties as well. Reflexivity being the case in point here. So, that self-knowledge is ultimately a matter of self-transformation in both tradition, Platonic and the Buddhist, whether it is ascending the, say, ladder of loves in the symposium, or being absorbed in the contemplative view of the form of the object, or establishing the foundations of mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition. So whichever the case may be, we have a common focus on self-knowledge as self-transformation. Of course, this emphasis on the experiential dimension of self-knowledge stands in tension with the largely discursive and argumentative ways in which these experiential claims are advanced. For Platonists, at least, this tension explains why both the pursuit of self-knowledge and the denial of its distinctness from other kinds of knowing, of justice and the good, for instance, can lay claim to the enduring legacy of the Notre maxim. We must wrestle with the question whether we know ourselves by some special kind of knowledge or simply become present to ourselves by inhabiting both poles of the dialogical relation. The constitutive question of self-knowledge, that is, what is that in virtue of which there is knowledge of knowledge or awareness of awareness, cannot be adequately, however, pursued without considering more narrowly which specific features or dimensions of the mind best capture the many facets of self-knowledge. Of all those features, it seems that, or so I claim, it is a self-referential awareness that best grounds both the Socratic Platonic wisdom and the kinds of skillful attitude that certain Buddhist thinkers in the tradition of Dinaga and Dharmakirti, among others, regard as essential for successful epistemic practice. So let me conclude by saying that as promising as the account of self-knowledge we glean from Alcibiades may seem, scholarly opinion on whether self-knowledge is even central to the Socratic project remains divided. Despite Socrates' seeming disavowal of knowledge in the Apology, some take self-knowledge to be both possible and central to his pursuit of truth. Ballard, Guthrie, Warneck, Nightingale, Rowe, and many others. But even among those who take a sympathetic view of self-knowledge, opinions differ about how best to understand it. Is it just an awareness of oneself as a knower, and hence as the sort of being that must strive to overcome subjective habits, to bring one's actions and beliefs in line with objective standards? This is at least how Sarah Abel Rapi understands the scope of self-knowledge in the key dialogues that pursue the topic of the Apology, Charmides, even Theaetetus. That is, as primarily elicited by the Elenchus, Socrates' aporetic realization when prompted by the oracle that he knows what he does not know. Now, does self-knowledge entail the presence of a particular dimension or of mind or soul, what Nightingale, for instance, calls self-reflexive awareness, as a sort of expert self-scrutiny of both of our epistemic limitations and our capacity to live up to the demands of reason, justice, and the good? Perhaps. But in her analysis of the limits of perceptual accounts of self-knowledge in the Republic, for instance, McCabe draws attention to the paradox of reflexivity. How can one see oneself if it is oneself that does the seeing? In seeing only shadows, the prisoners in the allegory of the cave see or recognize themselves as shadows, even if only at first. So perception cannot be a good vehicle for self-identification and thus for self-knowledge. For McCabe, at least, the solution to the paradox of reflexivity lies in the conception of self-knowledge that is ultimately, and I quote, stereoscopic, multi-perspectival, reflective, and broad in scope. But this stereoscopic vision is still perceptual, even if only in scare quotes, even only in a metaphorical sense. It is seeing in a sense of understanding that we figure in what we see, what we do, and what we value. So, if self-knowledge lies at the origin of preoccupations with living well, with the good life, and with a systematic orientation towards the pursuit of truth in both public debate and personal examination, perhaps it lacks a single dimension and must instead be viewed as something that is neither a given nor guaranteed. According to the constitutive account of self-knowledge that I've sketched here, self-knowledge is not about discovering a self, but about the achievement of a particular kind of relation of the self to itself, which conceives of the self as a knowing agent rather than as an austere and impersonal soul. Of course, the fact that careful deliberation and self-scrutiny could provide unity and coherence to our lives does not mean the selfhood so achieved is something determined or fixed. But it does mean that the sense of knowing itself sets self-knowledge apart from other types of knowledge. That the sense of knowing itself may be grounded in a reflexive or self-reflexive dimension of awareness explains why the self-knowledge project needs at least a phenomenology of self-experience or subjectivity, if not necessarily also a metaphysics of self. For the Buddhist reductionist, reflexivity can do little beyond breaking the spell of anonymity. Minimally subjective conscious episodes might not be enough to ground thoughts like, I'm in pain, nor can they establish what makes some thoughts appear as mine and others as yours. The question whether there can be such a dimension of self-consciousness that can know itself and all other cognitions, but not be itself the awareness of anything, as we saw, is precisely what Charmides addresses. If what a Delphic maxim urges is that we get to know ourselves as human beings rather than souls, that can only be accomplished by a personalized kind of knowing that admits of ignorance, can recognize idiosyncratic character traits, and is able to assess our physical, moral, and intellectual attributes correctly. The ways in which we know ourselves may partake of this reflexive form of consciousness that I've outlined here as a common feature of both traditions, but their expression is inescapably personal and the task infinite. Thank you.